What I want to talk about today is how to use a grid to transfer the information from a photograph to your drawing paper. So this is a clear page holder, and I've taken a felt tip pen and marked this into first half. So this is 11. I've marked it at 5.5. I've marked it at 2 3/4, and I've marked it at 8 1/4. And then I marked it up here, same thing, 5.5, 8 1/4, 2 3/4, and then drew these lines across. So we did the lines with a felt tip pen. I have these felt tip drawing pens, which worked really well, but a Sharpie with a small tip on it will work also. I didn't have much luck using a ballpoint pen, but the felt tip worked quite well. And then I did the same thing, divided this into 4, and so we're at 8.5, so we're 4 1/4, 2 1/8, and 6 7/8. No, 6 3/8 for the mark here. Same with over there, did the lines across. And then I just want to sharpen this up a little bit. Let me start up here so that I'm not coming across it. It's a good idea to let the one set of lines dry. So this has been drying overnight before you mark the second set of lines, because it takes a little while for the felt tip to dry on this surface, and it'll smudge really easy otherwise. So just make that a little bit darker. So the purpose for this is that we then want to be able to put a grid onto our page that's going to match the proportions of this grid. And it's also going to show us, let me just slip this photograph in here, and it's going to show us what is in what place in the photograph. One of the difficulties that we frequently have, because our minds want to decide what something is, and before we've really looked at it very carefully, is to actually get the proportions in the right places. And so if we look at this, we'll notice that these trees come up 3/4 of the way up. These mountains also come about 3/4 of the way up. The bottom of the trees are a little over 1/4, but up here they're almost, well, actually the last one here is at halfway. And so we can do this triangle here quite easily then, where if we're trying to figure it out in our mind, quite often we have a hard time figuring that out. So we can do this where we're just going to do it the same size, or I can use it to enlarge to a larger drawing. So let me just show you on the larger drawing what's going to happen, because it might be a little easier to see. So let me set this aside, but yeah, I'll show you on the other one. What I want to show you is that the piece of paper you're going to go to is also going to be gridded up into 4 and 4, so that you have it in halves and quarters, and we also need to get it at the same proportion, and I want to show you how we're going to find that proportion so that we can get it correct. Otherwise you're going to have one area stretch and something else squish. If you've done anything with Photoshop, you know that you can play around with photos and you can make them skinnier or fatter, and they come out funny looking quite often, and we don't necessarily want that to happen. So to make sure, so this is 8.5 by 11. My big sheet of paper here is 14 by 17. And what I'm going to do first is that, and let me just use my other photograph here. Well, it doesn't matter. We'll do it through this, because then you can see what happens. We're going to line this corner up, line that up. So I want to get this down in this corner nice and good. Now, if the proportions are correct, then I can draw a line through the center of this, right from that corner to this corner. And so it's going to draw up through there, and where it intersects up here is going to be the corner of the new piece. Now, if I don't want this if I want to do, you know, a 16-inch long piece rather than a 17-inch long piece, then I can find where that 16 intersects here with this square. So it's going to intersect there. And then I can find out how high that is. And yes, I was correct that it should come out to about 12. And let's see. Yeah, that comes right on there. So it's about 12. And then I'm going to measure out here 16. Measure out here 16 just to make sure that I've got this nice and straight, because we're going off of this nice square corner of the piece. And then right now that's measuring up at 12 1/4, but I'm gonna just ease it down a little tiny bit. Actually, let's bring it up from this other corner just a little tiny bit. Just because it's going to be easier to make this into quarters if I have that 12. And this is 12 1/4 here. And then we're going to just take a little bit off the very bottom of that, and that's going to be 12. So this is basically the same way I made the other grid. And if we're working with pre-cut pages, then you know it's square, and you don't have to worry about getting a square on here to square it out. So now if I've got this correct, so just take this back into this corner and make sure I've got it set up correctly. And then let's run this back through here. Yeah, so it's saying it actually should have been 12 1/4, but that's okay. We got a little bit coming off the bottom edge of this that is going to be, that we can play with. Now, let's go ahead and get this divided into half of 12 is 6, half of 6 is 3, 3 plus 6 is 9. Half of 12 is 6. Half of 6 is 3. 3 plus 6 is 9. 12 minus 3 is 9. All right, and this other way we're at 16 and 4 and 12. Now, if you didn't have this nice easy size, then you're going to have to take your calculator and divide whatever you've got into 4 to find out what each one of these spaces is going to be. So now this is going to be here. And if I wanted, I could add diagonals into these lines to help me see things in the picture. I don't always do that, but if I've got something complicated that I want to see just where it's going to be, I will. All right, so now we've got our grid, and we can now start identifying pieces of this. So let's start with this triangle of trees, or I could start with this little piece of grass here. So the piece of grass, let's start with this piece of grass. It is, so this is my quarter, it's about halfway up that quarter, grass starts right in here. So I'm going to just make a little mark there. This other piece of the grass, this is about 1/3 in through here, so about 1/3. That grass is going to be right about there. And actually, let's just make some little X's so we can see that a little easier. And this grid that I put on here, you're going to end up erasing it later. So in this area right here, the grass is down about 1/3, 1/4. That's not quite half, so it comes to about there. This is, yeah, it's about 1/4 of the way up there. And then at this one, it's a little, this one is, this is halfway, down about 1/3. And then it comes up to here. So now this is going to come down, oh, that's what's wrong. Ha 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 ha, Margaret, no wonder. This comes to here, And this comes 1/4 down there. Totally screwed that one up, didn't I? That's why it was not acting like it should, because I didn't have it to my halfway. All right, but even so, this has got a little bit of curve to it, and so we can see that it's got some shape to it as we bring it across through here. And you can see that on where the grids line up. Now, our next part of this is these trees. Our bottom of this trunk, I'm gonna just pull this in front of you here because you can see it a little better. The bottom of this trunk, there's a lot of glare on this. The bottom of this trunk is right about here. And then my last trunk, this is the halfway mark, not the 3/4. The last of my trunks is, it's right about here. And then this one in the middle, there's one that crosses right here and just about at half. And its buddy is down just a little bit. There's a nice little negative space right in there. Nice little negative space. This tree comes a little more than half back there. And now the tops of these trees, so that I'm just sort of placing a few things so that I can know where they're going to be. This other set of trees here, there's another one that crosses across this. It's halfway between that, comes out at a little triangle, and then second tree, and that still is only 1/4 to 1/3 of the way over. Okay. Perspective is something that is deceiving to us. So we don't really expect to see these things in the distance as small as they are or as big as they are when they get closer. So having something like this grid is a good way to remind us and sort of tell us that maybe things are a little bit different than we thought they were. And I'm just seeing a correction that I need to do on this tree here. Maybe this needs to come over here just a little tiny bit to make that work. Okay, so now this other tree, this is the 3/4 line. So it's up here in this 3/4 line, and there's branches, but it comes up into there. As we get down into the halfway point, this is maybe 2/3 of the way up here, and at the this halfway point, 3/4, I'm seeing this at just barely over a half. And then when it gets down into here, my last tree, this is maybe 1/3. Okay, so that tree is going to end up in there. So this tree line, so think of this as just a big wedge here. So this tree line, and we'll work some more details into it later, but the tree line is going to come in through there. And then on this side of it, our tree trunks are coming in on this line. And then the flowers come just below this. Flowers are pretty much right at that, and the flowers pretty much are coming in on this line right there. So that's sort of the placement of our trees. This one, I'd say he's going to come down a little more. That trunk is going to come into here. This other branch comes out maybe at 1/3. And then how much of the space here, so that side of that trunk is right about halfway. So I have to make it even a little bit bigger than I had there. And as those run up, we got some nice little negative spaces back in here. And then these branches are going to continue on up until they go almost into that corner. some breaks in it for the flowers. That's that. This is another branch there. Okay. And then back behind here, there's another little tree here. There's another little tree here. There's another tree inside of that. There's another little tree right in here. So we're looking at big things, finding the smaller things, and then I can come back and do the detail work in here. Now the mountains, this halfway point, and then it's going to come up and be just a little bit over this. And then this has a little mountain here. And then it's going to come down to that halfway point. Halfway, is that halfway? Halfway's down here a little further. So this actually can come in a little lower here. Second part of this mountain, halfway in here, it comes over this. And then there's a tree back in here. And then we've got all the little small branches. You know, so this guy here comes up and points at that tree. This one comes up a little further. Okay. And then we've got some little trees over in here. There's one that's shorter than. The little branches go upward, a little shorter than. This one is a little bit taller than that. And there's one right at the edge here. And this one is a little shorter. Okay. That's tree there, tree. And then there's several more trees that we see back in here. Fairly quick to get the basics in. It'll take more time to come in and do the rest of the drawing, but we suddenly have the perspective here. We've got this thing of grass going off into the distance. We have the trees going off into the distance. The close ones are bigger, the far ones are smaller. The mountain, you know, this is something that if I were going to paint this, I would probably change this mountain and I would make it bigger. I'd bring this mountain up, keep that same shape to it, but bring it up into here a little higher. I think it would make a nicer looking picture, but I'd probably leave those pink blossom trees the same way they are. So anyway, that's what's going to happen with that. You'll be able to spend as much time as you want to finish this. Now, I did promise that if you didn't have a clear sleeve to work with, now you can do this exact same thing on a smaller sheet of paper and just be transferring it into almost the same size, but you're looking at it a little different than you would if you were tracing it. You're actually seeing some of these bigger shapes. So we're looking and identifying these larger shapes of items and putting those into it. So we're finding those shapes and seeing where they intersect, how they intersect onto this grid. And once I have the basics all here and I don't need the grid any longer, I can erase it and take it out of here, or at least erase it enough that it's not going to be dominating my drawing. I could do this from, you know, if you had a small snapshot that was a 4x6, you can do the same thing. You just make this grid smaller, and then you still keep that same proportions, and you still keep whatever your photograph is. You want to have the same proportion running through here to make sure that you're going to have it match what you're doing with the photograph, so that this ratio, the shape of these is the same. So if I were to take one of these, let's just show you how the ratio works a little tiny bit. Maybe it'll help you think about this. So if I just take one of these blocks, so this is my, well, here, we'll do it up here so you don't have the second one showing. So then I should be able to run a diagonal through this little one and still have it the same thing where it goes through that corner and it goes through this corner and they end up matching. So then the proportions of this little block is the same as the proportions of that block. The proportion of this whole big thing is the same as my large piece there. Okay, so that's going to be our assignment for the day. We can talk about some more of these when we actually meet on Zoom. Oh, I know what I was going to do. If you didn't have a sleeve and you needed to work directly from the photograph, I recommended going ahead and printing a second photograph so that you could just draw on this one. So I can go ahead and draw these lines on here right onto my photograph. And I don't do a lot of this. I try not to do this if I can avoid it, just because sometimes it'll obscure things you want to see in the photograph. So you have to be a little bit careful that you don't end up with something obscured. So, you know, if you do print a second one, then you've got one that's clean, so you can see what's going on with it. Let's get this marked. 5.5, 2 3/4, and 1, 2 3/4. So that becomes 8 1/4. Okay. 2 3/4. 1, 2 3/4 is 8 1/2, and let's just, yeah, that's right. This same idea, the same method of gridding up a scene can be used when you are plein air painting. I like using my hands as a grid. So I've got that. It could be used the same way that I did with having that sleeve on there. But coming back to this, now if I were doing plein air painting, I can use my hands so that in between my fingers, this is a half, this is a half, and then right in the cut of my hand here is another half. So if I'm doing a still life or if I'm doing plein air, I can hold this up and get an idea of what is in which quadrant. Because one of the things with perspective that we have a problem with is that we frequently don't want to get what needs to be in the bottom of the painting or even the bottom quarter of the painting there. We tend to want to put it higher so that when we draw pathways, they tend to want to look like they're standing upright. And the only way to keep them from standing upright is to know how far they really go up in the picture and how big they get at the front versus how small they are at the back. Same with this row of trees. It's going to sit down and look like a row of trees if we get that perspective correct. Another photograph that I'm letting people work with, much more complex than the trees, but same idea. And so this is my halfway mark here, right here. And so we can see that that street doesn't even come up halfway. It's between a quarter and halfway to the top of it, and then where does it really end up in the photograph? So my halfway mark the other way is showing that the street is all over on the left side of the piece, but it also shows that this wideness that we get at the front is actually about, well, this side of this actually comes off right there, this side of it comes here, and it's bigger than halfway. But here at the back, it is only 1/2 inch wide. So 1/2 inch versus 7 inches, actually more than 7 inches because that comes a little further there, almost 7 1/2. So it makes a really big angle in here, and being able to see where it is on the grid will help you to see that and get that put in properly. more about perspective another time, but that's sort of basics on it. So I think that's it for right now. I'm sure you'll have questions.